So today we've got Professor Bland, Michelle Sanford, Ryan Armstrong and Matt James as our panel. I'll get them to briefly introduce themselves and then we'll kick off. Through the course of the panel though, I'd really love it if you've got any questions at all, please do shout out. We might send a roving mic out, and if you do have questions for the panel, please, just raise your hand and Tanya will come and find you. Thank you, Tanya. And you can ask your question. So, Professor Bland.
Okay, so I'm Phil Bland. I'm Director of the Space Science and Technology Centre at Curtin, and as you've heard, we're trying to build small spacecraft to go to the moon and other planets.
Michelle?
I'm Michelle Sanford. I am a Developer Engagement Lead at Microsoft, and I'm also the Chairman of the Australian Computer Society in WA.
Ryan?
I'm Ryan Armstrong. I am a Principal Software Engineer at Canva in the Infrastructure Group, and I'm deeply invested in all things reliability engineering.
And finally, Matt.
I'm the Chief Technology Officer at VGW. We're a social gaming company. Although I'm a CTO, I'm a software developer at heart, and I've been doing so for a couple of decades now.
So to just get us started, I think one thing that we sort of all have in common on the stage is that we've all been in technology in one form or another for quite a while. Ryan in particular, I was chatting with you last night about your career journey and having worked at Facebook and at Dropbox and some pretty kind of exciting tech companies, and then having come back to Western Australia. I'd love to hear your opinions on kind of career pathways for individual contributors. So people like software developers and engineers and other technologists who don't necessarily want to manage teams or take their career in that direction. What opportunities are you seeing for those really senior people with a lot of experience who want to stay technical? Who'd like to go first? I'm looking at you, Ryan.
So opportunities. There's a couple of things I'd like to touch on here. One is like the number one way to create opportunities for yourself is to not self-select. This is something that I really struggled with earlier in my career, and I spent a lot of time working for companies when I should have moved forward because I didn't think that I was capable of the next thing, or I thought that the people working in Silicon Valley or working in bigger companies here in Perth wouldn't be interested in me. And what I found when I actually sent them my resume, when I gathered the courage to send them my resume, was that wasn't true at all. They were very interested to speak with me. So my lesson to everybody is just go and find out what they're looking for. Have those conversations, send them the resume, go to the interviews, and maybe you're not ready, but you'll find out why not. You'll get signal on where your gaps are, and then you can start to elevate yourself towards those opportunities. The other part to this is in terms of progression as an IC. One thing that kind of sucks in our culture here is that there tends to be this expectation that you're an IC and then you become a manager. That's how you progress up. One of the things I loved about working for Silicon Valley companies is that there's two completely different tracks. They have a management track and they have an IC track, and both of those you can be promoted all the way up to the top, and you can earn the same amount of money and have the same amount of leverage, but by being either a people manager or by being an engineer. One of the things I think we do here in Australia to shoot ourselves in the foot is when someone gets really, really good at engineering, we kind of level them out and we say, hey, you're earning as much as we're willing to pay. If you want more, you've got to become a manager. And frankly, what a dumb thing to do.
I think perhaps it's a difference between tech companies and other industries. So definitely you see that in industry, but working for Microsoft as a tech company, we have those two streams as well, and it is one of the things that pleases me a lot because I'm thinking there are some Microsoft managers out there, and I don't want to insult you, but I really don't want to be one. It's very administrative and political, and all the things that I like about working in technology can be done as an IC, and you can go all the way up and you can do those roles, and even the people coaching part. So, Gia's my my mentee, and I work with her on a lot of things, but I'm not her people manager. And so I get to have all the fun of coaching her and helping her and working with her without actually having to do the boring stuff.
So I work at Amazon, and I see the same thing, right? We have the same pathways that go all the way up. But for local companies that may not necessarily have sort of evolved that way as well, what are you seeing in terms of corporate culture in Western Australia in particular, as opportunities for, you know, people who are getting to that point in their career where they're sort of being forced to make that decision of, well, if you want to basically get paid more, now you've got to be the boss of people.
Actually, can I go? Oh, is this working?
It is.
It is working. I can't really.
It's magical.
So, because it's really interesting for me in Australia, coming from the UK and seeing how the UK university systems work from a kind of engineering and technical point of view. Because in Australia, it really sucks in universities, right? So you know, I mean, if like, you know, if you're an engineer at Curtin, then you're basically, you know, your job is to do labs. And what is that about? So there is no career pathway. And it's, you know, so for us in our team, we're actually trying to build career pathways in an environment that really isn't designed to do it within universities. And obviously universities are ridiculously constrained because, you know, we've had a 10-year interregnum of a Liberal government that hates science and universities, which is a challenge. But just the structure of how that works is very odd for me. So
I agree a little bit on the universities lacking a little bit of focus on problem solving in general, and also practical skills and things like that, and they seem to be a little bit lagging behind to the point where I think companies actually really need to have a solid internal training program now for software developers who are coming out of uni or anywhere else. There needs to be real thought put into that training program and those levels for progression for people and growth, because people aren't ready as soon as they come out of uni generally, and you need to have a solid ramping or like on-ramp into your company for them. But it's also a good retention tool. We have, you know, training programs right up to the highest level of software developers in the company, and I think that's really important to have as well, because, you know, people want to keep leveling up their skills. They don't want to stagnate. And if you want to retain software developers, or if you're looking for a job somewhere, you should actually test them on whether they do have a training program and what that looks like.
Yeah, I've seen in some of our sort of large, well-known companies here in Perth, they tend to have some type of graduate program, right? And there's a huge focus in that first 2-3 years of someone's career after they've graduated from university on training them and potentially rotating them through different parts of the business so they can learn all these things. But then you kind of graduate from the graduate program, and then, yeah, the training and enablement seems to just taper off at that point. I think technology companies tend to do a slightly better job of it, and obviously VGW as sort of a, do we still call VGW a startup?
Not anymore.
Not really. But as that type of business, like a digital native business, I know from experience from people that I know who've worked there, that training is something that is a bit more ongoing. Has anybody, actually, maybe a good question for the audience, has anybody seen those sorts of things in the more traditional businesses that kind of do carry on? And how do we influence that? Anybody from the panel? Anyone from the audience, actually? Would be...
Another question. Sort of on the topic.
I can hear you, yeah. Continue shouting.
So I find it weird that we're talking about like people coming out of degrees, like fuck degrees, like. The dev agency, we do internships with people who do degrees, and they can tell me how fucking tree was done, but they couldn't fucking write code, right? And people who like teach themselves, they come in and they're so hungry and they can build stuff. And like, I mean, degrees still have value, but like 9 times out of 10, a self-taught engineer, although they've learned
I think we're talking about
Can I respond?
upskilling people.
Right? So 9 out of 10. Speaking as a scientist, show me the data. Okay. All right. Cite your sources. Splendid. All right.
I kind of agree with this guy, you know, fuck degrees for software
I
engineering.
believe, is this guy Alex?
I actually think it's more important for... Alex. I feel like it's more important in other engineering disciplines, but not so much in software development. We take people out of other programs, like She Codes, which is a 6-month program, and people, they're starting at the same level as uni graduates. So, yeah, I tend to agree with you. I think in a very short period of time, you can learn a bunch of practical skills and forego a lot of that algorithm stuff that really isn't used in practice, and get to where you need to go.
I'm gonna compromise.
Go for it.
I'm sorry.
I'm going to say we are so desperate in technology careers right now that we really can't say it's just that or it's this. It's all of you. All of you. If you have a degree, you've got certain skills, you've got certain domain knowledge, you've got certain stuff. If you haven't, like we're taking, in Microsoft, we have internships, traineeships coming through the TAFEs now. There are definitely people in my office that did not finish their high school, whatever you get at the end of that in here. It's not about that. It's about, do you have that growth mindset? Do you have that continuous learning? There are some people who, when they leave school, they are not ready for a job. They don't have that emotional maturity, and going to a degree gives them those extra few years in order to learn a bunch of extra skills, not just the domain knowledge, but also how do I manage money, how do I, work with other people, or how do I join clubs or whatever. So yes to them, and yes to everyone else. All of you come, we want you all.
I'd like to defend the degrees a little bit, if I may.
Yeah, go for it.
Devil's advocate. So actually, I totally agree as well. But, I have no degree, and look, I agree to a point, but I want to offset this point by saying, like, I had the really cool opportunity while I was working for Dropbox and Facebook to work with graduate students from MIT, Carnegie Mellon, Stanford, Harvard, and these guys coming out of those programs hit the ground running without exception. Now, from a scientific perspective, there's some filtering, right? Because I only got to work with the candidates who made it through the interview process. So maybe it's not all of them, but there's definitely a subset of engineers coming out of those programs who hit the ground and just were spectacular out of the gate. And the mentoring was really about mapping their skills to a business rather than teaching them computer science principles. So in that sense, I think it's a little bit of an indictment on the education, on the computer science education programs that we have here, because I do concur with what you've seen, that like some of the graduates coming out of these programs are not ready for the workforce. But that said, that's not all of them either. Like, there's different paths to success. My path wasn't through university, but I know plenty of really talented engineers who did come through, WA universities for computer science programs.
Well put.
So we're talking down the Phil's end, we've got like sort of astrophysics and extremely, like physics, hundreds of years old, computer science, 100 years old, less. Are we missing something in like,
40.
in terms like engineer and architect? Like, is it a fundamental difference in the disciplines that we're in? Because Phil's just completed, a project where he spent 5 years and then goes live. In software, we have to spend 5 years before we release something. Like, I don't know. Will our discipline ever meet up? We just have to work for a bank. I take your point, maybe. Yep.
That's a really interesting. So, like philosophically, do you mean in terms of, right? Because it's a thing that I've always been fascinated by, kind of how fields, whatever it is, grow and mature and plateau, as you say, and I think everything in human knowledge has done that at some point. So, once upon a time there was pure, like chemistry was a sort of a pure, like basic research discipline, and then people discovered quantum mechanics, and now it's only ever applied because we know it, in a fundamental level. So I've always been fascinated by that. I mean, speaking as, again, I'm going to use the geology excuse and then diss my entire discipline, is that plate tectonics means we have a grand unifying theory of geology, so there's actually not a lot to do anymore for the Earth, right? It's in the decimals. So philosophically, I would say yes, that there will be a plateau. You'll get to a really interesting place where it's, okay, what happens now? Yeah.
I reckon too.
Speechless. It's fantastic.
Hot take is, I reckon it might even be a little bit of the inverse, where like computer science started out as a very clear engineering and scientific discipline. Like when you think about like the invention of the internet coming out from Berkeley, like this is very much a scientific discipline. But I think because computer science and software development is so accessible, right? Like all the information's up there online. We can all install the programs on our machines. We can all read about it on Wikipedia. We can all decompile the program and have a look to see what's happening. There's open source. I think that has like created an ecosystem where there's so much other practices and technologies that emerge out of it that don't look like engineering or science. So they can kind of like dilute the term a little bit. But yeah, that's my take.
I think there's a lot of knowledge out there on how to build good software. I don't think we're applying it very well at the moment, generally. To be honest, like, getting the basics right, getting security right is just still not really happening across the board. Delivering outcomes on time and like to that spec, we're still, continuous delivery principles aren't really being implemented across the board, I feel. And I think we've got a long way to go on that.
Just on that security point for a second, somebody mentioned something today to me that they'd heard from a customer, which was around treating security as, or the level of effort that you put into security as a business decision. And how do you quantify the value of good security? Because you have to pay for it, right? So you have to spend time like becoming good at building software which is secure. So what's the value that I'm getting for that cost? And the inverse of that is how do you calculate the cost of a security event to, brand damage, potential data loss, all that kind of stuff. For some of you are building software, some of you have customers who build software, some of you don't build software at all, Phil. That's fine. How in your businesses, how are you thinking about that sort of stuff, about security and the importance of it, and how that factors in, how you can argue for it when you need to make a business case? It's not a sexy question, I'm sorry.
I told him I didn't want to talk about security. I think it's super boring. But in terms of my business, they think it's the most important thing. And there are so many people in security positions and security roles. There is so much outstanding security software that we have across all our product lines. They think it's the most important thing. But not for me, though.
That's all right. Either of the guys who are actually building products?
I've had the good fortune to work for companies who value it, right? But I think how to sell it, like how to quantify it and say, I want engineering hours, I want dev cycle time to work on paying down tech debt for reliability is a big one for me, or for security. That can be hard, and I found the most effective strategy is just don't do it and wait till there's a security breach, and then they go, oh yeah, I should have.
In most products out there, there's attempts to breach your or exploit vulnerabilities all the time against your product. I think just surfacing that, to the people working on it has an immediate effect on what they focus on. If they can see we've had these kind of DDoS attacks and these kind of exploits are trying to actually be exploited in your product every day, they immediately start bringing it front of mind.
Cool. Since it's not a sexy topic and we don't want to talk about it, I'll completely change the topic. So the talk that Professor Bland gave was super interesting, and last year our lock note was Adam Simpson from the West Coast Eagles talking about data science, right? So not software related at all, but both super interesting. What do the panel think are the up and coming kind of technology opportunities that aren't necessarily just going and working at one of the existing companies that are here in town and either building software or selling software or whatever it is? What are the interesting technology things that you see on the horizon for people who are technically minded in WA and who want to stay in WA?
I mean, I think there's the next decade in terms of spaceflight is going to be just really bonkers, and it's going to be like nothing any of us have ever seen before. I got into it because of Carl Sagan and the Voyager missions, and then hearing folks talk about Apollo. But I've been working with people from NASA for like 20 years. I've never seen them as pumped as they are now, and I've never seen as many private sector companies in it as there are now. There are companies that are making money by selling payload surfaces to the surface of the moon. And all of those spacecraft and all of those systems need people like, that are in this room to develop, autonomous abilities, for that stuff, so that, because trying to operate it all manually from here is a complete nightmare. So the more autonomy you can put on those spacecraft, the better. We've just had a really interesting conversation in our first mission concept review for our orbiter. And we realized the biggest problem is actually getting it to understand where it is in an orbit and how much, so that then can we get that information quick enough to then modify its position and basically keep it from crashing. Now, if we can put that on the spacecraft in a small package with not that many computational resources, then that is going to save us like millions of dollars, and we'll have a very successful WA mission, which would be very nice. So actually, any of you folks, please come and work with us for not an awful lot of money, and I'll... So there's a downside. Yeah, sorry. Yay.
We all heard that.
Well, where we were talking about plateau, technology plateaus before, actually I was thinking that more than 20 years ago I did my dissertation in computing science on chatbots, on the ELIZA chatbot particularly. And yeah, there was a massive wasteland of nothing going on in AI and chatbots for 20 odd years. And then all of a sudden, now AI, machine learning, all of that is like, it's exploding. There is so much you can do with all of that technology, and it's super accessible to anyone. You don't have to be a deep academic with, with all of this knowledge of the code or even of the technology. You can, go into all of these products and just like click on things and see how they work. And so, yeah, I think anything in machine learning and AI, data science, all of those are like massive career opportunities that are exciting and fun and accessible at every level. So that you do need, for the data scientists, you need them with real deep domain knowledge as well as some technological skills, but there are people at the start of that journey as well who have a genuine interest in the data, or people who have a genuine interest in building things on AI and exploring it, who can start with hardly anything. So I think it's that's a great opportunity there.
I actually think there's a lot of interesting companies in Perth. There's a lot of small companies doing things in AI and in space. I know First Mode's another one of those who's working in space. I believe the American company is outsourcing to Perth, so go figure. There's AI companies like Isotana. I recommend working for a small company at some point. It's an incredible amount of fun. I worked for VGW when it was 10 people, and you learn a whole heap. So I wouldn't discredit small companies just because they're not a big brand, because they could turn into one. So I highly recommend that. And if you can't find anything, then work remote, because most people around the world are working remotely at the moment anyway.
Climate Clever has the best developer in the world working for them, so.
Inside joke.
And we're saving the environment.
Yes. Is she still there?
She's up here.
You should wave so everyone in the audience knows who the best developer in the world is. Her name is Marina. Speak to her afterwards.
She's very competitive in the deep racer competition today, actually.
There was a couple of questions over here.
Yeah, there's some questions.
I just want to ask, you just touched base on one of the, I think, topic of the hot topic of remote working, especially the COVID introduces working from home, remote teams. So remote teams and also, outsourcing. So I want to see what's the panel's opinion on this in the new environment we're living on this.
So I'll just rephrase that question for anybody who was up the top and didn't hear that because the mic didn't come on. The question was basically about remote working opportunities and sort of where do you see that going, particularly with obviously COVID? Ryan, I'm sure you've probably got a take on that.
That's not what the cough was for. So I work full-time remote from Perth for Canva in Sydney. And I kind of had forced remote like most of us for COVID, and have done some work for startups in London remote in the past. But this is the first time it was like full-time. And on the whole, I love it, right? Like I really love not having a commute. I love having the flexibility in my day to help my kid with school, or just kind of pace exercise and eating better and all that kind of stuff that I really struggled with before when you're on the go. So love that flexibility, but it also sucks in terms of like building relationships and trust in the business, particularly as you get to more senior levels. They're not just giving me a user story to go implement. They're giving me like an organizational wide problem that spans multiple teams that needs a 5-year plan. And getting the right people into the room and having those organic conversations and building connections is really, really hard through a Zoom screen. It's not impossible, but it takes a lot of like very deliberate effort on my part and a lot of very deliberate planning to like orchestrate every interaction with my peers. So yeah, it's a balance, right? It's a trade-off. I look forward to the borders opening and flying over to Sydney a little bit more often to spend some time and shake some hands and have some water cooler conversations at least once a quarter or something. That's my take.
Well, we have always been a work from anywhere organisation. They don't really care whether you are in Sydney, Singapore or Seattle, whether you're at home, customer site or a cafe. You have your work that needs to get done, you need to get that done. Outcomes, not hours based as well, so do it however, whenever, wherever. But it's definitely true. In 2020, I travelled to Belgium and I was stuck there for 5 months. I had WA state government as my customer at that time, and it made no difference at all. We we continued working. I mean, obviously, I was getting up at 2 a.m. to continue working with them, but I quite like that. I find I wake up at 2 a.m. anyway, so that was really good for me. And yeah, when I moved to this role, it was actually advertised on the careers site as in Sydney. Obviously, I'm not in Sydney and I'm not going to Sydney, and it was never a discussion point. You know, I think it was up there as a default because that's the biggest site, and the people advertised on the job just automatically put Sydney, but it's not required. Yeah, and it's better. It's better for you, and it's better that you just get your stuff done without seeing where your bum is.
With a lot of people starting to realise that they can do this, they can work for companies, they can do it remotely. I do it myself. Are any of you seeing any impacts on how easy or difficult it is to hire people and their expectations of what they can and cannot do in a role, either within your own companies or across the industry? I mean, some of us have got a lot of customers, right?
So colleagues of mine on the moon mission have hired folks from NASA that are still in the Bay Area, but are contributing to the mission from there, and that's just lovely. Yeah. So we can, does that answer the question? What was your question? That's kind of, yeah.
The question is, are you seeing changes in the way you have to recruit, basically?
Yeah, basically.
Because people are like, hey, I want to do this from, let's say, Margaret River. Anyone who knows me, hi. Yeah, are you seeing changes in the things that you need to, like the flexibility you need to offer as an organization, or different benefits that you need to offer to support people in those types of roles, or not?
I mean, it's sometimes difficult if you've got a whole team that's in Perth, say, and we hired someone who was the only remote developer in Sydney, and that's tough. You've got to make accommodations for that. So starting a remote team, I think, is difficult. Don't underestimate that. We have some teams who are completely remote, even though they're in Perth now, so they just communicate constantly on Discord. They've got like open audio. They just fire questions as soon as they've got them. So from that team's perspective, it's almost no different to being in the office. They meet in the office maybe once a week just to catch up and do some whiteboarding. But they're pretty much working as effectively, if not more, as a remote team, even though they're all co-located.
Cool. We've just been given a signal that we've got 5 minutes left. Are there any more oh, look at all those hands. Back here, what's your question?
So this panel, in a lot of ways, represents the front line of tech in WA. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what the current state of play is in terms of technology in this state, in this country broadly, and where we're going, where you guys are taking. What do you see tech evolving into in Australia, and particularly in WA, over the next kind of 20, 50 years?
Can I have a thought on that one? I know I'm just the moderator, but so I'm a solutions architect with AWS, and so I've worked with a number of different customers, and the thing that I'm seeing a lot of is companies that are not necessarily software companies per se, like mining companies, banks, things like that. They're starting to realize that they need those capabilities, and so all of those companies are becoming technology companies in one way or another, whether they like it or not. Thoughts? I don't want to butt into your panel.
Yeah, so that's a lovely question. So I think we will succeed in building Australia's first interplanetary class platform, and that'll get taken up just like hotcakes from loads of other Australian universities, and then you will see multiple Australian missions exploring the solar system, and that will trigger even more human exploration of the solar system, and will help SpaceX with Starship get to Mars. Boom.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, and, yes, and because the thing that, WA does so well is remote operations on mine sites, and that's going to be really critical, actually, for the kind of stuff I talked about, in situ resource utilization at the moon. So people often think about it in terms of mining. I don't really. It's like, if you go to Antarctica and you chip a bit of ice off outside your tent and you melt that, you're not actually mining the ice, right? It's just an awful lot easier than taking liquid water on a ship to Antarctica. So that's a lot more, that's kind of what we'll be doing at the moon. So I think, to do that, you'll actually need the whole bunch of robotic assets all operating in a coherent manner, and I think that's a thing that WA can do really well. So while we're exploring the solar system, our companies can be running NASA's entire remote operations program.
I think we have time for one more question. I thought I saw one down the front, yeah? Just speak loudly.
So with tech changing just about every year, and a new JavaScript framework every day, what approach would you guys take to learning new things and staying ahead of the curve?
Oh, sorry, I'll repeat the question. With technology changing as fast as it is, what advice would the panel have for kind of staying ahead of the curve?
So I love learning, and I love all the new things that there are to learn. It is a little bit overwhelming in that there's so many choices, so many options, so many things you could invest your time in. At Microsoft, we get 1 learning day per month, and you're allowed to spend it on whatever you want. I think what I've been finding most success about is either doing a certification, picking one and studying that and getting it, or something to build, something fun to build, and then, build on it and learn how to do it by building it. But I don't think I would choose something based on what I think the industry needs or what my company needs. I would choose what I'm personally passionate about, and therefore I think I would learn it better and grow more as a result.
I think a lot of the principles don't change between those frameworks. I don't learn every new JavaScript framework that comes out. I try and look is it doing something that's fundamentally different to the other ones I know? If so, then maybe yes. I think you find 90% of the cases it's not though. So I would just ignore those because you don't have time to learn every single one. I think it's important to stay ahead of trends and things like that, because in a fast changing industry, of course, things are going to change dramatically. Serverless in the last decade, obviously, is one of those things. So you should have, been staying ahead of the curve on that, because that's going to become the default in future. So if you spot those kinds of things, then definitely, yes, dive head first in. But a lot of the other stuff is just noise.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Michelle. With that, I think we're out of time for the panel. So if you could give us a big round of applause for our panelists.